Ahoy and Happy New Year! In this very new year, we can expect quite a few news about MMOs as well as potentially a few upcoming betas or even releases. At least one of these games has a pretty significant overlap in design with New World, and I thought it would be interesting to have a closer look at this. The game in question is Throne and Liberty. A couple of days ago, the official NCSoft YouTube account posted a director's preview for the game, in which they talk about a lot of the gameplay choices, design choices, how the game's gonna feel, and what we can generally expect. Now at this point I have to make a disclaimer. Throne and Liberty has been to development hell and back. This game was originally meant to be the next title in the Lineage series, called Lineage Eternal, and was apparently started around November 2011. Throne and Liberty in itself is now a reboot of that very game. So while currently the info we have from previous announcements is that the game will come out in the first half of 2023, this was not again mentioned in the director's preview, and I have a feeling this game might be delayed once more or multiple times more. As you will see, the whole project is extremely ambitious. This begins with the fact that it's intended to be released for both PC and consoles of some sort. They don't specify the console in the director's preview. What I've found on the wiki so far is that it's meant to be released on PlayStation 5. Both versions of the game will also have different UIs, so it's optimized for whichever way you prefer to play. On top of that, while you can't play Throne and Liberty directly on your phone, it is meant to be streamable on mobile devices, so that way you can technically play it on the road as well. And not only in this regard does Throne and Liberty try to cater to a lot of different players. The goal with the game itself also seems to cater to pretty much everyone. They want to have the competitive side of things, but they also want to have the freedom to enjoy adventures, explore the story and so on, and they also want to offer a place for people who just want to have fun. The MMO also features both PvE and PvP. But things get even more ambitious. Another major factor that was described, especially in the director's preview, are the weather and environment changes. The devs say this living world is all about adapting to the environment. So for example, weather can change terrain. An area can be completely flooded, or certain mobs are only active during day or nighttime. And what we can see in the trailer is that certain spells, for example, have different effects during different weather. So for example, a lightning spell may, under specific weather circumstances, turn into a chain lightning. Players will also somehow be able to orchestrate different environmental settings. On paper, this sounds extremely cool, but to me this also sounds extremely risky. First of all, I imagine that quite a few of those weather settings would have a pretty significant impact on performance, especially if a lot of things have to be calculated differently depending on the circumstances, but even more importantly, I imagine that they will have major implications on balance. Say, as a hypothetical, rain makes fire spells weaker and makes arrows slip out of archers' hands sometimes, while lightning spells get stronger. Now what happens if in a PvP siege of some sort, this gets utilized by the enemy team? You're running a lot of archers and a lot of fire mages, and they're running a bunch of mages with shock and electricity spells. Suddenly, the battle may no longer be decided by skill, but rather by who takes better advantage of the elements. But since there seem to be ways to influence the weather, maybe your team can change the weather to be sunny, but maybe then the enemy team can change it back again, and maybe that becomes a battle of who has more weather changes on them, and that's effectively the types of consumables you have to farm for larger guild fights. On the other hand, it could also be that those weather effects simply get disabled for PvP sieges, but we have no information on it so far. There's potential for interesting dynamics here, but I could imagine that there are quite a lot of ways in which this could become annoying and frustrate players that are simply after a balanced PvP experience. But there's more to the game worth talking about. The world is described as having no boundaries, not sure how exactly that will work. However, what I found interesting is the way they describe the dungeons. So they showed a dungeon that basically has multiple floors layered above each other, and all of these are kind of connected together, so if you're progressing further into the dungeon, you can still see the entrance below you, for example. And what the dev stated is that you can still give aid or damage to others on different floors. So players can develop their own routes in the three-dimensional terrain of Throne and Liberty. I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of this is, or how you would use this effectively in PvE scenarios at least, but I am most certainly intrigued about the idea behind it. And on the topic of intriguing, let's talk about the combat and weapon system. This is very clearly inspired by New World, with the roles being decided by your weapon choice rather than you actually choosing any form of class. Players can change their weapons at any point to suit the situation. Additionally, each player can utilize 2 different weapons at once and connect the skill sets of those different weapons in different ways. Not only that, there's also an interesting form of counter mechanic. Any weapon has some form of defensive action, and these defensive actions protect players with good timing. I personally really enjoy timing-dependent counterattacks, and I wish more games had them. There's no confirmed list of current weapons yet, but the weapons that we can see in the trailer are a bow, a greatsword or Zweihander of some sort, daggers, sword and shield, as well as an option to use a sword without a shield. Also a sword being used by a mage. I'm not sure if that has the same mechanics as a sword and shield or if that's more of a spell sword. A staff, a wand and a spellbook, and dual crossbows. On the sword and shield, for example, we have some form of chain hook attack as well as a shield bash with a knockback, whereas the daggers seem to come with some form of shadow step where you dash behind the enemy and also get an iframe while doing so. When it comes to PvP versus PvE, in a slightly older article from MMORPG.com from early November, they stated that it seems like the game is more focused on PvE first, and PvP is secondary to that. But in the director's preview, they actually spent more time specifically talking about PvP compared to PvE. Well, there was an older post discussing some sort of a criminal system where you could attack players even when they were unflagged. The new trailer doesn't give the impression like that is still in the game. Instead, there seem to be dedicated PvP zones that are time dependent. So by default, a lot of areas seem to be safe zones, and the statement from the devs is that players are allowed to decide if they want to participate in PvP or not. But when one of those regional events or certain raid bosses are enabled, then the PvP in the same zone will also get enabled. You know beforehand there are timers for that, but if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you might find yourself in the middle of a fight. These PvP competitions are active for approximately 20 minutes and allow you to, quote-unquote, move up in rank, whatever those ranks may be. While I generally prefer systems where people are PvP flagged more often, I could see this system working given the PvP events happen with enough frequency. It could lead to a much higher concentration of the players that are actually interested in fighting against each other. It's also not the only version of PvP, there are also guild wars. There are certain so-called possession stones, the blessing stones and dimension stones, that can only be held by guilds and give the guilds enhanced guild capabilities and the procurement of necessary raw materials, whatever may be behind that. So these stones will be fought over, and what the devs also said is that it's very important for these guilds to learn the terrain that they're going to be fighting on. Again, something that strongly reminds me of the way that wars work in New World, even though the emphasis on terrain seems to be much higher here, which I enjoy. The character customization seems to be very in-depth. Not only do you have a lot of options to build your own character, but you can actually build your character based on actual photos via AI if you are inclined to do so. To even make that possible, there needs to be a pretty significant amount of customization options. The devs state that they have spent a tremendous amount of time on optimization, and they promise that the game will run as smoothly as possible. That unfortunately doesn't really mean or tell us anything, and in the earlier playtest trailer they were definitely still struggling with optimization. But that is obviously not reflective of launch. Given the visuals and the large number of players that we see in the same areas in these trailers, I would expect the game to require at least a decent PC though. A huge question that is often hanging in the air, especially when it comes to South Korean MMOs, is the monetization. The MMORPG.com article actually quotes the earnings report from NCSoft, where they talk a little bit about how they plan to monetize. They're aiming for the game to have no pay-to-win features and are considering battle passes in the West. They generally want to keep monetization as fair as possible. They state that anyone who chooses to play the game for free should not feel coerced into making purchases to make their gameplay experience enjoyable, while paying customers should feel like their investment is sufficiently rewarded. Take this information with a grain of salt. Not pay to win doesn't mean not pay to progress, for example. There is no legal definition of pay to win, so there are a lot of loopholes when it comes to the exact specifics of what is or isn't pay to win, and I would imagine that your or my personal perspective of pay to win might differ from the devs. So in that regard, it is a matter of waiting and seeing. What is very promising for the game is that NCSoft is actually a pretty big studio with more than 5,000 employees. They also have a long history of publishing and often even developing various MMOs such as Lineage, Guild Wars, Blade and Soul, Wildstar, and many more. So they do have the experience and manpower for a big project, but the question is if it's enough for a project as ambitious as Throne and Liberty. I will definitely follow along with its further developments and keep you updated if anything significant happens. If you'd like to see that, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified. Thanks for watching, TeakSloth, out.